Is social democracy fascist? Well, the short answer is no. But the long answer is important. For those of us who are social democrats, it is necessary to check our positions and our values.
Are we the baddies?
Asking if social democracy is fascist also grants clarity on what social democracy and fascism are. So let's begin with the latter. Fascism is hyper or ultra nationalism by any means necessary. This definition can be extrapolated from Benito Mussolini's The Doctrine of Fascism. Infamously, Mussolini is the ideological founder of fascism, and throughout the doctrine of fascism, we can see Mussolini's advocacy for hyper nationalism.
Fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state, a synthesis and a unit inclusive of all values, interprets, develops, and potentates the whole life of a people.
Fascism justifies any and all actions for the power of the state, which is not the majority of people in a state or nation for Mussolini.
Fascism is therefore opposed to that form of democracy which equates a nation to the majority, lowering it to the level of the largest number.
So now that we have a definition of fascism, is social democracy a form of fascism? Communists such as Stalin have argued that social democracy is fascist, collaborates with fascists, and allows for hardcore fascism to emerge. Essentially, the collaboration that social democrats have with fascists, according to communists, is that social democrats are ultimately capitalists and so will help fascists stamp out socialist movements.
Social democracy is objectively the moderate wing of fascism. There is no ground for assuming that the fighting organization of the bourgeoisie can achieve decisive successes in battles or in governing the country without the active support of social democracy.
But there is not a lot of historical precedent for this idea, with the exception of 1918 Germany, where the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party, used troops against the KPD, the German Stalinist Communist Party. But social democrats and communists alike have resisted the rise of fascism, and more specifically, resisted the rise of Nazism in Germany. Anyone who is not fully on board with communism is obviously not a fascist. And it is largely centrists and liberals who support the rise of fascists while not being fascists themselves. Social democrats and communists clearly have differing ideas of where society should go and have had many conflicts, but both are anti fascist notions. There is also a false equivalence with fascism always having to be capitalistic that communists will make, that fascism must necessarily be under the productive mode of capitalism. However, fascists do not have to be capitalists, but thus far have always been capitalists for a couple of reasons. One, capitalists weaponize fascism to defend laissez-faire capitalism. And two, capitalism is a good at making things go about overproduction. And so as a result of this overproduction, you end up with a lot of extra goods and resources. And having extra goods and resources is really good for wartime and military conquest, something that fascists are very interested in. Fascists are interested in imperialism, be it direct military imperialism, economic imperialism, overproduction, which is a byproduct of a capitalist economy, is useful for those imperialist tendencies.
An imperial nation, that is to say, a nation which directly or indirectly is a leader of others, can exist without the need of conquering a single square mile of territory. Fascism sees in the imperialistic spirit, i.e., in the tendency of nations to expand, a manifestation of their vitality.
And so fascism, though, could still use any economic system, as fascism is not an economic doctrine, but a hyper-nationalist doctrine. This does not separate fascism from capitalism, but capitalism is not inherently fascist. Obviously, pure laissez-faire capitalism has plenty of issues.
The list of things we all agree on is getting pretty thin, but I'm happy to report it's bad to waste food is still on there. Unfortunately, in the United States, we waste between 30 and 40% of all the food we grow. And that sucks. I'm talking 14% of our freshwater and 18% of our cropland is used to grow food that we don't eat.
It has plenty of issues without fascism. What fascism does is it can make capitalism in its laissez-faire form even more cruel. Fascism weaponizes capitalism. In this sense, fascism and capitalism are often in a relationship that is mutually exploitative, where fascism will use capitalism for its ends and capitalism will use fascism for its ends. While social democracy seeks to soften capitalism, social democracy often gets described as a band-aid on top of capitalism, whereas the fascist is just going to make the wound worse. Social democracy is also not an inherently nationalist ideology, but an economic and political ideology which could be applied to any nation in theory. Social democracy operates like a political ship of Theseus. Social democracy looks to alter the political system piece by piece, like how the ship of Theseus is disassembled plank by plank. For social democrats, it does not matter if the political system is metaphysically the same political system post changes. Social democrats seek changes to the political system from within a given system. So, social democracy is a progressive ideology, not a revolutionary ideology. Social democracy is an extension of liberalism for all of liberalism's imperfections. And I mean liberalism as the Enlightenment era idea of liberalism, certainly not neoliberalism or liberals in the modern political American sense. We're talking about the notion of liberalism that Thomas Jefferson takes on, the pursuit of happiness, equality, freedoms of expression, these liberal ideas away from monarchical ideas. And what social democracy seeks to do, social democracy seeks to be a proper fulfillment of Enlightenment era liberalism. So, social democracy, though, is not a utopian ideology, but one that seeks regular betterment for people at large. And that is regardless of those people's nationality, racial background, ethnic background, sex, gender, and so on. So, social democracy could be applied globally and multiculturally. Maybe not universally, but no matter, one should not be forced to become a social democrat. And that's kind of just in the structure of social democracy, right? In its democratic nature. And so, in a sense, true social democracy is pacifistic in a manner akin to Henry David Thoreau's pacifism, pushing peacefully and democratically for ideas such as universal health care, the abolition of the death penalty, and universal education.
Fundamentally, the problem with social democracy and reformism is that you're working from within a liberal democratic system where you campaign and you work really hard and you push through some reforms, and it's great for like 10 years. But eventually, because you live in capitalism and because the liberal democratic system that you live under is designed to favor the economic base, those reforms that the working class fights and dies for, they're eroded over time. If you don't have any kind of plan to defend these reforms that you've worked so hard for, besides just, oh, well, everyone just has to vote harder next time. The result is that the Social Democrats became huge, in the 1920s and throughout the 20th century. They were huge, and they pushed through some great reforms that really made people's lives better until suddenly they weren't in power anymore. And then over the span of like 10, 20 years, a lot of that was just done away with. Just poof, which kind of shows you how fragile social democratic workers' reforms really are, because it's not a systemic change that is done. They're reforms that are very easily replaceable and done away with. They're not ingrained into society as a whole.
Now, social democracy may not be doing enough for many thinkers, acting as a band aid rather than as a cure for the ills of capitalism and general societal problems. Social democracy participates in exploitation, right? It participates in hierarchy, it participates in class structure. And so for many, this is off putting. But social democrats would argue that they are in pursuit of a pragmatic document. And that, yes, for some it may not operate fast enough, but it is better to get things working and surely working than to burn the whole thing down and you get messed up, whether from the new system of government you have installed or from outside powers seeking to take down what you have built up for others. It is also important to note, and this is something that people forget, is that when a revolution takes place, people are harmed. People die, people suffer. And so revolutions are risky and costly, to put it mildly. And in this sort of sense, right, what social democracy also seeks to do is prevent a slide into authoritarian forms of government, be they authoritarian socialism, authoritarian communism, and certainly fascism. And in addition to all of this, social democracy has had visible success by many metrics. We can see success most famously in Scandinavia and the Nordic countries, but we can also see success under FDR's New Deal. And we can also see that, New Zealand has had success in this. Mexico recently with Andres Manuel Lopez and Claudia Sheinbaum, right? There has been a growth in people's per capita. Now, this isn't to say that these countries are perfect. We must call out FDR's internment and suspension of habeas corpus in his administration. We have to call out New Zealand for their ongoing dismantling of indigenous rights. And we cannot ignore the corruption that still exists in the Mexican government. However, what we can see in all of these cases is an improvement in individuals' access to education, a rise in their GDP per capita, a rise in their quality of living, especially due to greater expansions in access to health care. And so what social democracy has done, it has shown a material improvement in people's lives every time it has been implemented. And so the point here is that social democracy pushes for steady improvements in all aspects of society in a progressive and policy-focused manner. And this could be used to counter fascism. The main reason why people become fascists is due to them having financial and material issues. This is not an excuse to become a fascist. This is an explanation as to why people go down the fascist route. Desperate times call for desperate manners. Now, social democratic societies have statistically improved people's material conditions. And we can see this in improving education access, improving general living standards, employment, economic security, the list goes on. Now, yes, this has come at the cost of industrial jobs for service jobs, but again, there's an overall improvement of material conditions for the vast majority of people within social democratic societies. And ultimately, these societies have been better at shifting individual laborers away from industrial jobs into service jobs. And so what we end up with here, if people are going down the fascist pipeline largely due to material concerns and anxieties, not universally, but by and large, if you improve material conditions, they will be less willing to go down extremist routes, extremist tendencies. There would be less to be frustrated over. Now, this is not to say that social democracy is the answer to all of the world's problems, but it certainly provides a proven counter-narrative against fascism. A fascism that in every instantiation of its existence does not truly care for people's material conditions. And this is why social democrats universally are against fascists, because fascists do not seek to improve people's material conditions. They do not seek to improve people's lives, where the social democrat seeks to improve people's lives through a progressive agenda.
That all being said, we social democrats have to do a lot more to fight against fascism. We have to fight harder to preserve the positive policies we have passed, and get new ones to become legislation. We cannot become complacent, enlightened centrists but instead need to work in coalition against the obvious horrors of fascism. But no wonder why some think that we are fascists, because we are too busy battling communists when fascists are knocking at our doors. Progress has obstacles that must be moved aside, lest we be permanently impeded or worse, backtracked. We must prove we are truly anti-fascist. We cannot just claim to be so ideologically but must act against fascism to be truly anti-fascist.